We turn to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. In this chapter we read of the great heroes of faith in the Old Testament. We've seen Abel, Enoch, and Noah, and now we come to Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Now, here we read of the obedience that characterized Abraham's faith. We've seen in verse 4 the sacrifice of faith, and in verse 5 the walk of faith that Enoch had, the work of faith in verse 7, Noah building the ark. And now we come to Abraham, concerning whom it is said, by faith Abraham obeyed, when he was called to go to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. Obeyed. And that is the thing that's spoken of concerning Abraham's faith even by James in James chapter 2, where he speaks of Abraham our father being justified by works, James 2:21. When he offered up his son Isaac on the altar, God told him to offer up his son Isaac, and he obeyed. And it says there in James 2:22, you see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. Verse 24, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And so, it says here too, in Hebrews 11:8, that Abraham's faith was characterized by obedience long before he offered up Isaac on the altar. It started with God calling him in Ur of the Chaldees to leave that country, to leave all his relatives when he was 75 years old, and to go out into another land, to sell his property there, and to go out to live as a pilgrim. And we read here that Abraham obeyed. And verse 9, by faith he lived as a pilgrim, as an alien, as a foreigner in the land of promise, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He had revelation concerning the city that God was building, the New Jerusalem that we read of in Revelation 21. And he wanted to have a part in that. He wanted to live for those things that would be eternal. And therefore, he walked on this earth as a pilgrim. Now, this would also be the characteristic of all those whom God calls today. We're told in Galatians chapter 3 that Abraham is the father of those who have faith. And his example is what we are to follow. Like God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, today he is calling out a people for his name from the world. We read in Acts chapter 15 that Simon Peter says, Acts 15:14, Simeon has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. And this is what God is doing in the world today. Like he pulled Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, out from among that idolatry, to walk by faith in an unseen God. Today, from the midst of the world, God is calling out a people to walk by faith, trusting him. And what will be the characteristics of these people? The same things that characterized Abraham. 1, he obeyed. And 2, verse 9, he lived as a stranger, as a foreigner in the land of promise, as in a foreign land. And this will characterize all who are true believers, that they will live in this world as in a foreign country. This is not their home, and they're not settling down here. And therefore our attitude to material things will be very loose. One who is attached to material things is obviously not living by faith. To live by faith, we are to live as aliens in this land, and symbolically, metaphorically, dwelling in tents, looking for the city which has foundations, for that city which cannot be shaken. We read in verse 11 about Sarah, and there we see faith in God's faithfulness and the joint faith of husband and wife together. By faith, verse 11, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. It was not through her own ability that Sarah produced a son, Isaac. It's very clearly written, she considered him faithful who had promised. God had promised a son, and she did not consider her own inability. This is another mark of faith, that when God promises something, the man or woman of faith does not look at his or her own weakness or inability or insufficiency. They are strong in faith, glorifying God, because they believe that God is faithful and is able to do what he has promised. These same words are said concerning Abraham in Romans chapter 4, where we read that when God told him that he was going to be the father of many nations, Romans 4:19, without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, in the deadness of Sarah's womb. Yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God, being fully assured that what God had promised, God was able to perform. Exactly the same words we see concerning Sarah in Hebrews 11:11. She considered him faithful who had promised. So the joint faith of husband and wife was in a God who was able to do what he had promised. No confidence in self and total confidence in God. Now this is something that we need to understand concerning faith. We read in verse 12, therefore also there was born of one man, that is Abraham, and Sarah being one with him, and him as good as dead. Both Abraham and Sarah, as far as producing children were concerned, they were just as good as dead people, because they were both incapable anymore of having children. And yet there was born of this one man, and him as good as dead, at that as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Now, him as good as dead, in that lies a clue concerning the ground from which faith can sprout and grow. We have to come to the place where we are totally impotent and consider ourselves to be just as good as dead. Nothing good in us. We cannot produce anything for the glory of God. Abraham tried once in his own strength to produce a son that would please God, that was Ishmael, but God said, that's unacceptable to me. What we produce in our own strength is not the product of faith, and it's unacceptable to God. But when Abraham came to the place where he was as good as dead, Sarah as good as dead, then they were both ready to have faith, and then they could trust in God alone, not God plus themselves, but in God alone. Faith is not trust in God plus me. It's trust in God alone. And when we come to that place of impotence, helplessness, then we can trust in God alone.